This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist and an empowerment mentor for women. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Now here is today's episode. Episode 116. Before we dive into today's episode, if you are liking what you're hearing on the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, I encourage you to go out to iTunes and leave me either a star rating and/or go in there and put in an actual review itself. It helps with the algorithms, which then helps promote the podcast for other women to find it when they're searching in iTunes. Thank you again for your support. Now here is today's episode. Well, welcome, sisters. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this conversation today. I have Dr. Sarah Mackay, and she is a neuroscientist who translates brain research into strategies for professionals working in health, education, and coaching. She received her PhD from Oxford, but after 4 years postdoc research, hung up her lab coat to set up communications business bridging the gap between the lab and everyday life. Sarah is the author of the Women's Brain Book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones, and Happiness, which explores the female lifespan through the lens of neurobiology. In 2019, Sarah hosted an episode of ABC Catalyst exploring brain health, biohacking, and longevity. Sarah is the director of the Neuroscience Academy, which offers professional development training in applied neuroscience and brain health. Sarah has been published extensively for consumers and professional audiences. She's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Garcia, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and on Mamma Mia. She can be seen and heard on SBS Insight, ABC Catalyst, ABC Radio National, Radio New Zealand, and Channel 7. Sarah lives in Sydney's northern beaches with her Irish husband, and together they are raising 2 surfer dudes and 1 Cocker Spaniel. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, hey, before we dive too much into your book today, I want to give the ladies who are listening just a little bit of a background. Like, why did you actually write this book?
That's such a good question. I'm one of these people who didn't actually ever have a book in them, and I know there's lots of people who have a burning desire, and it was more of a people tell me I should write a book, and I'm like, oh God, this sounds like lots of hard work. I wrote a PhD thesis once, and I was like, it's a bit hard. It may look like I have lead a very busy life, but I just a little bit lazy at times, and I was called up by a very charismatic, we were talking about her before this podcast came on, a very charismatic book publisher and agent who was like, you must write a book. And I was like, oh, I don't know. She said, let's meet for coffee and chat. And so I thought, well, this lady sounds like fun. So I went along, and one of the very first things I said, her name's Jan Rickmans, was, look, I don't have any ideas for a book, so I'm not sure where I would even begin. She said, forget about that. Tell me what you have ever written for an audience before that's really resonated. And that was easy because I'd been writing a year or two earlier for the ABC, a series of articles about brain health. Mm-hmm. And one of the articles I had written at age 40 was around menopause and brain fog, and how it was not the first signs of Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Mm-hmm. And we had this enormous outpouring, enormous response to that one piece of women going through menopause or in perimenopause going, oh, thank God, I just thought it was me, who were worried about what was happening with their minds. And they were so reassured. And so my agent turned around and said, well, there you go, write a book on menopause. And I was like, I'm 40. I don't. That's something my mum once did with her friends. Little did I know, 5 years later, that biological clock, it ticks on, let me tell you. Anyway, she then turned around and said, well, what about baby brain during pregnancy? Is that a thing? And I was like, well, no, because I grew up in New Zealand. And I was like, we don't do that in New Zealand. Women get out and use our brains. But then I had a moment, one of those kind of moments in life when everything sort of stands still. And I went, oh, pregnancy, menopause, brains. I've been the owner and operator of a female body and brain my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a neuroscientist for 25 years, and I had never before considered my female biology through the lens of neuroscience. And that's not just, maybe I'm a bit slow on the uptake, but neuroscience is an incredibly broad and rich and deep subject.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that there was this world of neurobiology I had never yet gone down, a path I'd never explored, around puberty and periods and pregnancy and menopause. And I had questions like, why are women more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety than men?
Mm-hmm.
Why are women more likely to have Alzheimer's disease than men? Does our childhood as a girl influence our later experience as a woman? Is there some neurobiological pathway in there? And I thought, well, maybe I could write a book along those lines, simply going in and answering the questions at each point in the lifespan that I didn't know the answers to. Because for me to engage in a project, one of the kind of the joys and the things that makes me so excited is finding out answers to questions that I have, and then doing the research, and then kind of pulling it together and turning it into some kind of digestible piece of information. So that was sort of the genesis of the book, and really kind of what kept me going over the next year while I was writing it. Was every day I would go, wow, I'm going to find out the answer to a question. I don't know the answer yet. And that was a real thrill, actually.
That's awesome. I'm so glad the charismatic woman got a hold of you and said, come on, let's do this. And you went along.
Yeah.
I've heard as well so many people like, oh, you want to write a book? I'm like, I have no desire to do that, because it's a lot of work. And because you decided to go through, I mean, I'm literally looking at the contents of the book in front of me here. And it's like, it's the whole lifespan of a woman. And it's not like just, oh, here's just a couple little nuggets of information. I mean, you've got in-depth of research that you've done, which is beautiful, because I know of some books, right? When I used to do a teen podcast, there was specific books on teen brains, things like that, but it wasn't on a specific gender. It wasn't on a specific, or like the lifespan of it. So I love how you cover so many things in this book.
Well, I thought, and I kind of say it's like a womb to tomb look at the female lifespan. And I thought what's really important from the work that I've done, and even going back to sort of my PhD research, which was always very much around brain plasticity and how experiences shape and sculpt us, that if I was going to be looking at any point in the lifespan, the brain sort of role in that would be influenced by what had preceded that. So I really needed to sort of start off at conception, needed to look at in utero life, and then at the experiences of childhood. And then, because it was a book around, I thought this was very much going to be a book, went in very much with the mind of a neurobiologist. This is going to be a book about biology. It's going to be taking a look at hormones, mostly how our female biology shapes our brain. But then, of course, immediately I'm faced with childhood, and I'm thinking, wow, maybe our experiences as girls influence later health outcomes. It's not just biology. And it was a real sort of surprise, I suppose, to me once I started exploring quite carefully the research and academic literature and talking to people at each point in the lifespan. I realised we're carrying our life experiences kind of in our synapses. We're carrying our biology and the experiences we have in our synapses, and we're carrying our thoughts and our expectations and our beliefs that we've learned through experiences in our synapses. And these really shape us and set us up for each of these, especially for those major life transitions we go through, puberty, pregnancy, motherhood, menopause.
Well, so Sarah, as you were going through this, what I really wanted to focus on, because a lot of my listeners, right, they're in this midlife stage. So some of them may be in perimenopause right before it, or maybe in menopause. And the fascinating, I find, the research that I've heard about, stuff I've heard about, at least here in the US, right, there's a lot of fear around perimenopause or menopause. There's not a ton of information. And you even talked about in your book, which I had heard, I don't know, a few years back, like a lot of science research, there wasn't a lot of women included in it for certain reasons. And before we kind of dive into what you've discovered about menopause and things like that regarding brain and health, what were some of the reasons you found that women were not included in some of the research that was done in science?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So if you and I found that all the way through the book actually, and this has become a bit more of an issue recently. This idea that historically we do research on the brain in kind of two groups of animals, humans and then the sort of the scurrying animals of the lab, because essentially our human brains and our bodies are just kind of enlarged versions of a lot of other mammals out there. So we've done a lot of sort of neuroscience and psychology research on, rats and mice and other little animals in the lab. Primarily, the focus has always been on male animals. Clinically, if we look at the research that's been done on humans, primarily a lot of it, especially, for example, drug trials, have been done on young, fit, healthy males. One of the reasons is both in the animals and human populations is perhaps if you're trialling a new drug, you might not want a woman of fertile age just in case she happens to fall pregnant in the middle of the trial and the drug could inadvertently harm the baby. And so there are some very, very good reasons for women being excluded from some of the research that's being done. But what's happened over time, by virtue of the fact that there are safety considerations, but then almost because of tradition, we just always tested this on males, so let's carry on testing it in males. The default human model almost becomes kind of this sort of 25-year-old, 70-kilo, wealthy white Western male. That almost becomes the standard human. So this bias is quite pronounced in a lot of fields of research, and it's certainly been very, very pronounced in biological research, particularly pharmacological and drug research. Now, as I say, some of this there's really good reasons for it, but some of it's simply tradition and because it was easier. And the animal models, often it's because if we have young, fertile, healthy mammals, they often cycle through what would be a form of our menstrual cycle, much more rapidly. That can happen, every, few weeks. So what we do see is that the influence of the hormones can shift the biology slightly. So you're kind of adding what we might say noise or variables into the system. So if we can exclude that, it does make the data easier to analyse. But the knock-on effect of that, of excluding females from the research, has been that a lot of the medical care, a lot of the research then doesn't necessarily always apply to women. And, we could say, it's sort of straightforward sexism, lack of gender equality, etc. And that is kind of one part of it. But as I said, there have always been these safety issues or these variables. So what we're now understanding is kind of the error of our ways. So, which I think, it's a good thing that a lot of the top flight medical journals, a lot of the, like even the NIH in the US, when they're funding research, they now mandate that we call it biological sex when we're doing the research, because gender is kind of different from biological sex. When we're talking about doing this research, biological sex has to be part of that research. And it, of course, makes it a lot more expensive and a lot more complicated, but we are realising now it is important that this is done. If we look even many, and then there's some more entertaining kind of examples of how there's still this predominance of research in males. And if I can be so self-indulgent as to share one of the more entertaining examples, when I was doing the research on the chapter on love, sex, and neurobiology, and I thought, will there be one area of research that females predominate, and surely that will be on multiple orgasms. So that's kind of girls' thing, right? And so I sat down and I had this particular sort of format that I would go through to explore the research of a new topic. And so I was very excited about this day. I was like, multiple orgasms today, hooray. And so I sat down at my computer and I always would pull up the review articles in the academic literature first. So I would go into the search engine for the biomedical literature and I put in multiple orgasms, mechanism or neurobiology, I can't remember the exact word, and review article, and 5 review articles came up, and I thought, well, cool. 4 out of those 5 articles were taking a look at the possibility of multiple orgasms in men. Oh. They weren't even looking at where you might commonly find the article. And one of the titles of the paper was called multiple orgasms in men, what we know so far. But it turns out that if the article had have been multiple orgasms in women, what we know so far, we still wouldn't know anything either, because they're still busy trying to figure out how men can do it instead of looking at who can and what might be going on. So sometimes I just had hooted with laughter because the research that spat out was really quite interesting and showed the gender bias
just
quite
a wee
clearly.
bit, yeah.
But to make it even more, this is just a bit of an aside, a relevant story, but I'll tell it anyway. I've told this story about doing this multiple orgasm research every now and then, and I was at a presentation in New Zealand. I was back at my alma mater, Otago University in New Zealand, at a women's health research conference, stood up and I said, but anyway, so here's some funny biases in the research. And I actually put the front page of this journal article up about the possibility of multiple orgasms in men, and the crowd kind of laughed a bit. And then afterwards, this young fella came up to me and he introduced himself to me, and he was the author of the paper. I mean, he had been working in the US as a postdoc at the time when he had written it, and then he happened to move to New Zealand. He happened to move into a research lab. He happened to be at the conference when there was I making a joke of him, and he came up and he said, "Thank you so much for promoting my paper." I cannot tell you how mortified I was. My face was like one of those shock emojis. Anyway, you have to be careful about the information that you share.
But again, you're really showing truly the bias, but also some of the reasons behind, and how we humans in general often can get stuck in our old ways versus expanding out. And so it's really exciting to hear how scientists are expanding more of who they're including in experiments and trials and things, because
absolutely. And I think, to the credit of the scientific community, to the credit of a lot of the people who are providing the funding, and also in credit to the journals, even though they have their issues with not allowing every human in the planet to access the research when it's being published. There is a move towards improving this, and it's fundamentally important, because we need to be caring about the health of 50% of the world's population.
Yeah.
So I'm heartened to see that there is a shift where we've seen the error of our ways, and that's really one of the great things about science is it's continually, the scientific process is iterative, and it's continually improving and trying to improve, and so it's really good to see that this shift has been mandated and is now seen as important.
Yes, it is. I love it. Well, I want to kind of pivot just for a second here then and go a little more into perimenopause and menopause. And I'm looking at some of the things that I've underlined in the book. And you had talked about, and which again, I don't know if it's so well known. I think the information's getting out there more and more, but for women not knowing that perimenopause can actually, start well before menopause. Yeah. And I know that information. I think, when I could talk to family members and they're like, yeah, I had no idea. And now there's more information about that. But you talked about sometimes perimenopausal, someone you had mentioned in the book, they had talked about how perimenopausal mood disorders are not well recognized and they're wrongly treated with antidepressants because things will go down versus really looking at hormones. And I know for some clients that I work with, when they're seeing big shifts like in mood or they're starting to feel the temperatures rising quicker or dropping quicker, things like that sometimes their doctors will actually say, oh, it has nothing to do with hormones, or they'll take like a quick blood test and be like, it's not a big deal. And here's an antidepressant. And I've often recommended get another opinion just in case, but really rule that out. So can you share just a little bit, what are some of the things that go on, symptom wise, for women who are maybe in perimenopause or moving into menopause? What's some things people will recognize?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's probably best to sort of start off by defining those two words, perimenopause and menopause. So if we to be, and that's always what I try and do when I first go in to sort of start exploring an idea. Menopause itself is really defined as 12 consecutive months without a menstrual period, and that might not happen, and it could happen anywhere between sort of in a healthy woman without any other kind of issues going on, maybe somewhere between sort of 47, 48, 49 through to about 55. So menopause is really once everything has stopped, once your periods have stopped coming. It's after that period. Perimenopause is the phase of life, and it can be the sort of the 5 even up to 10 years leading up to that final period. So peri means around, so it's around menopause, and it's when it's primarily driven by your ovarian reserve. So it's really how many eggs have you got left? Have we still got enough healthy eggs to release? And what we start to see is over time, and most people will be familiar with this idea, of course, your fertility declines the older you get. And somewhere between the ages of 40 and 58, those sort of ovaries sort of start slowing down. So instead of that sort of natural monthly release of eggs and the pretty predictable ups and downs of the hormones, we start to sort of see it being much more erratic and unpredictable. So instead of at this nice conversation between the ovaries and the brain and the rest of the body via hormones as the chemical messengers, we start to see some months where you might get extraordinarily high levels of estrogen and the next month not so much. And what we suspect is happening, it's not so much the declining levels of hormones towards menopause, it's the roller coaster of hormones, which is very similar to what we see in puberty. When you enter puberty, a lot of the changes that we see and the difficulties people have are not so much, hormones are here or hormones are not here. It's the ups and downs. It's that erratic up and down. And that's what some people could have incredibly erratic roller coastering of hormones leading up to menopause. And they are probably more likely to experience symptoms versus someone who just sort of shows a bit of a slow, steady decline just because of some quirk of their biology. And so we often hear about, and I mentioned this in the book, and it's a little bit around similar to, how we think about puberty and the menstrual cycle. We hear about the period drama. We hear about the terrible stories, the difficulties, the hot flashes and the moodiness. And we typically kind of focus on the negative disaster scenarios rather than the perhaps 50% of women who sort of sail through without too many issues. There are women who go through menopause and kind of barely blink, rather like there are women who have their menstrual cycles every month and it's just kind of barely an issue for them. There are other people who find it far, far more difficult. And we think about 20% of women will have symptoms that are so severe it does start impacting on their daily life. And that's when we start seeing more extreme issues emerging. Perhaps the most common symptom by far of perimenopause is either those kind of, we call them hot flashes or hot flushes, when your temperature sort of suddenly rises and you become all hot and sweaty and sort of have to strip your clothes off to feel like you can cool down. Or that might happen at night, so you wake up in an absolute drenched sweat in the middle of the night. And that's by far and away the most common symptom of menopause. And we know absolutely that is caused by these very erratic and declining levels of the hormone estrogen, which is produced by your hormones. Estrogen is like the wonder hormone that we love. Neuroscientists love estrogen. It's a cognitive enhancer. It does all kinds of good things. When you're going through pregnancy and you're flooded with estrogen, it does everything to make your brain happier, healthier, and more high-performing. So when those levels sort of start to decline, that's when we see the problems. As I said, the most common symptom is the sort of thermoregulation issues. It's like you have an internal body thermostat and it's been set at a certain level for most of your life, and it suddenly gets a lot narrower when you go into perimenopause. So the top comes, the sort of the top level goes down, the bottom level goes up, and you only have to have your temperature fluctuate a tiny bit within there until suddenly you think it's 48 degrees outside Celsius and I've just run a marathon and I'm hot and sweaty. What's really interesting is if we start digging a bit deeper into some of the other symptoms, is often, not always, but often some of the symptoms may be a knock-on effect of perhaps night sweats. So the hot flash wakes you at night, you kind of feel uncomfortable, you can't get back to sleep. That happens night after night after night. You end up with many, many nights of disrupted sleep.
Yep.
As soon as your sleep's affected, everything else starts going downhill. And it may be that that's one of the underlying reasons why women are suffering what we would call brain fog.
Yeah.
Things are a bit fuzzy, you're forgetful. It could be due to lack of sleep. It might be, we don't know, due to the changes in hormones, but often what we find is if we supplement hormones in women who are having terrible struggles with all of this, we sometimes see a lot of other things improve. Similarly to mood disorders. Mm-hmm. You're far more likely to experience mood disorders. You're far more likely to feel blue and down, perhaps spiral down into clinical depression. You're far less likely to be able to regulate your emotional responses, self-regulate your responses to stress, and perhaps spiral into anxiety if you're not getting a good night's sleep.
Yep.
Okay, so that might be, again, part of this whole sort of symptom scenario that we see. Often what we find is once we start treating the hot flashes and the night sweats with hormones, if women choose to do that, there's lots of reasons for and against that, we often see some of the other symptoms improving. So it's like kind of looking around to see what's the chicken, what's the egg here.
Yes.
Yeah, how can we do that? And what we need, what every woman needs to do is find a really trusted health professional that they can work with them, who isn't going to be scaring them off one particular idea or another, doesn't have old-fashioned ideas set from back at the turn of this century where there was a lot of fear around HRT. Yes. There are a lot of really good options available for women to pick and choose from these days based on their health history. And it's so important that someone works with someone to help sort that out, because there's no need for all of these symptoms. There are options available.
That's what I so loved about your book. Really, it was more of encouraging women to, I like to say, advocate for yourself, but again, talk with that healthcare professional who knows different options. Because I've also heard HRT, the hormone replacement therapy, big, bad, scary, cause cancer, does this, does that. Yeah. And yet it's like, well, let's get the history. Let's know more about it. And how you said that if it's truly stuff going on with those hormone fluctuations and HRT can actually level that stuff out and the other symptoms go away, it's like, oh my gosh, there is no reason to suffer.
Yeah, there is no reason to suffer, but there's probably good reasons why people are scared.
Yes. And so, again, having conversations with your healthcare provider and going through what the options are. Because like you're saying, so many things, advancements have been made. And it's really looking at the pros and cons of all of that and just having more information versus letting fear stop you from even asking.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of benefits for HRT, but it doesn't suit everyone. What we do understand now is a lot of the messaging, or the sort of the fear and panic and the massive global withdrawal of women from HRT sort of back in the early 2000s came about from a couple of trials that were really looking at, let's treat menopausal women with HRT and see what some of the health outcomes are. It might improve their hot flashes, might improve their mood, sleep, etc., but does it have downsides? And it did appear that there were a lot of reports coming through. The data from these trials did start showing increased rates of particularly cancer, but some other health issues. What is really interesting was over the years, that data has been looked at very carefully, and there are a couple of huge problems with those trials that we didn't understand at the time, but we do understand now. The main one was that were a large number of women enrolled in those trials who were started on hormone therapy in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. So we were putting women on hormones, reintroducing hormones into their system, and they may have gone through menopause 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years earlier. Yeah. Those were the women who had hormones introduced into their system well past menopause. They were the ones in which we saw the increased rates of disease. Yeah. They were the ones in which we saw all of these negative health impacts that caused the trials to stop. Women who were started on HRT when they were perimenopausal, or right around that kind of golden window of menopause, who were symptomatic and who didn't have any other risk factors. They hadn't already had breast cancer. They didn't have high risks for other diseases already as part of their kind of history. Those women are absolutely fine. And in fact, we do see that the benefits far, far outweigh the risks. There is still a very, very slight increased risk of developing breast cancer when you're on HRT, even if you're healthy. But the difference goes from, if you are taking HRT, you have a 4 in 1,000 chance of developing breast cancer in the next 10 years. If you're not taking HRT, you have a 3 in 1,000. So it goes from 3 in 1,000 to 4 in 1,000. So 1 in 1,000 women. It's not great for that woman, but if you're aware of that, certainly here in Australia, and I'm not dismissing or saying breast cancer isn't terrible, but here in Australia, early detection of breast cancer, we have these 95% survival rates.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to weigh that risk up versus the benefits that you may get of actually getting a really good night's sleep, having no depression, having no anxiety, feeling great, being able to kind of carry on with your life for the next few years. And we're just starting now to get some data in, which is really, really interesting, looking at some of the longer term outcomes of women who did start taking hormone replacement at the right time, right around menopause or in perimenopause, not 20 years later. And we do see that it promotes brain health. We do see the risks of dementia and Alzheimer's declining, because it turns out women are more likely to be diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's disease later in life. And one of the best ways that we can prevent that is with keeping estrogen in the system. Men don't have it. They've never needed it. They're okay. But we are sort of seeing some knock-on effects. All of that said, it's far easier to kind of be fearful about messages that you've heard than overcoming those messages. But what I interesting, because I'm 46, no, I'm not, I'm 45 now. So, I'm kind of in, all my friends are kind of in their mid-40s or early 50s, and the conversations around this are far more pragmatic. Mind you, I'm a New Zealander, so that kind of comes with the upbringing being pragmatic. The conversations are more pragmatic around the options available, which I guess also reflects the messages that the healthcare professionals are giving my generation of women now versus women from kind of 20 years ago who were coming of age in the midst of the kind of the fear. So there's definitely in my part of the world, Australia, New Zealand, a positive shift towards, hey, let's take a look at our options. This might work for you, this might not, instead of, don't do that, it'll cause cancer. Yeah. Which is not correct.
Yeah. And I love, again, how you saw some of these things, or again, the scientific community really saw some of the issues regarding the research that didn't know at the time, that it's like, oh, wait a minute, women at this age reintroducing estrogen, it is going to cause some issues. But now again, there's more hope, like, wow, catching this in that little sweet window like you're talking about can really benefit so many women. And also, that's so exciting to hear, like, wow, figuring out again how it's impacting women's brains longer term regarding decreasing dementia and Alzheimer's due to having estrogen in the brain.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And just to sort of plug my neuroscientist researcher colleagues, the proof of that, we've got the proof in humans now, but that idea developed by doing the basic research in the neuroscience lab. We've got the little rats and mice in the lab, and people may have issues with research being done on that, but they give us so much information, and we thank them for that. But those ideas were initially, let's take a look at a menopausal mouse. A menopausal mouse doesn't usually live for very long. Once they're beyond their reproductive years, they don't need to survive. But if we do supplement those mice with estrogen, we see that they were healthier. If we gave them supplements of the hormones far beyond their reproductive years, that was when we saw the damage, when it was reintroduced. So we had the idea, and we had the brain studies, and we had all of that sort of set up from the basic primary research, and then we were able to translate that into humans. Go, actually, look, here's this great option for those of you at this point in life. And look, I spoke to lots and lots of people when I was researching this particular chapter, and there was one women's health researcher in this space who said to me that he sees, women maybe being diagnosed with cancer and going through cancer treatment at that point in the lifespan, and not giving up their jobs and being able to kind of carry on because there's so many support systems. And he said we shouldn't have women going through perimenopause giving up work because their symptoms are so bad, when we can do so much to support people. So again, it's just about being informed and working with someone who is too.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. And yay for neuroscientists who love everything about the brain.
Me too.
Well, I want to just kind of talk just a brief little bit then about the brain fog and dementia, because I know we were talking like, okay, is it really due to, lack of sleep, insomnia, stuff like that? But there's also, again, what you started the conversation with. Women have a big fear, like if they start to forget things, like all of a sudden that's dementia. And you made a distinction in the book, like, yeah, no. Let's talk about what those two things are.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a quite a good sort of phrase to keep in mind. The difference between dementia, Alzheimer's disease is one. It's the most common form of dementia. Dementia is kind of the description of symptoms. Alzheimer's is the most common disease that causes those symptoms. So I do use them interchangeably, even though they're not identical. Mm-hmm. But if you had Alzheimer's or dementia, here's the difference between normal forgetfulness and that, and it is forgetting your car keys is quite normal. Finding your car keys and forgetting what they are used for is cause for concern. Yes. So all of us forget things all of the time. And it is a little bit of a kind of almost a cognitive bias. If you sort of start worrying about your memory, you start thinking that you're forgetting things, you will then notice every time you do, that's going to give you a little bit more data to kind of almost support the fear that you have. And you would probably see this in clients dealing with anxiety all the time. Mm-hmm. It's almost like you're going out searching for facts to justify this feeling that you have. And you're going, oh, well, I am getting forgetful. Well, there we go. There, I've got more proof. I've got another data point. When someone has Alzheimer's disease, they're starting to show that serious decline in memory. It is impacting their ability to live their daily life. They're not just forgetting where they put their car keys when they come home. My children can never remember where their school bag is. They can never remember where they took their shoes off. They can't remember where their lunchbox is. They can't remember if they have homework or not. They can't remember that they had music lessons today and not yesterday and not tomorrow. They don't have dementia.
Is that called selective memory?
So we have these different ways of kind of framing the experiences that we're having based, we've got this filter, we've got this lens. And so this is what we see. Perhaps you're just forgetful because, let's face it, it's 2020. It's a really stressful year that every human on this planet has lived through. Yeah. That's going to be disrupting your sleep. That's going to be disrupting, just the increase in stress levels and hormones that we've all experienced. Mm-hmm. Unless we're very, very skilled at managing that is going to impact our ability to attend and focus on what we need to. Yeah. So your everyday forgetfulness is not necessarily something to worry about. If it is, go and talk to a really good health professional and talk your worries through with them. It's pretty common, and they'll be able to explore that with you if they're the right person. And it's so important to find someone that you feel comfortable with to share all this with and discuss it through. And if you're 48 and you're trying to homeschool your children, you've perhaps got an unwell parent, you're trying to hold down your business, you're getting hot flashes at night and so you're not sleeping very well, it's probably not a surprise that you forgot something as unimportant as where you put your car keys when you came in the door.
Exactly. Yeah. Got lots of things pulling your attention and just a wee bit of stress there. And definitely not going to remember every little thing. So it's totally fine. Well, Sarah, I've just got to say this again, ladies, I cannot recommend her book enough. It's just a wealth of information. And I know you put this in your website as well, like your courses that you do as well. You really do not only want to kind of do the pragmatic stuff or practical stuff, but you add in humor. You really take the language of everything that you've done and you make it just, oh, that's what that means. Oh, that makes more sense. And it's just so helpful trying to remove any of the old stigma, to unlearn stuff that hasn't been helpful, to learn like, this is my body. Let me advocate for myself and find some answers so that you're not having to suffer through this part of midlife because you don't need to. There truly, truly are options. And I think it's just lovely what you've done and what you've created.
Oh, thank you. And and I try and keep it, this is a skill I've learned from my husband, just to try and keep it lighthearted and a bit of humour in there and a bit of lightness because life is so serious. Yeah. And, we can just have a good old laugh about menopausal symptoms, really. If we could just have a bit of a laugh about the fact that, you might be suffering hot flashes and you're in an office meeting. It doesn't really matter ultimately if we have a good approach and mindset. I know that that's sometimes hard to achieve, but even when it comes to women's health and biology, I think we can, be a bit lighter about it and try and find some humour. And certainly that's what I try and do when I teach is, that's one way to just keep kind of humans engaged,
right?
To make it fun. We do that for kids, okay? We work really, really hard to make learning and education enjoyable for young people in the classroom. There's no need for adults to have to suddenly be really serious about everything we learn
right.
and just, take it all just, on board like another burden. We can introduce lightheartedness and curiosity and engagement in there. We try that, and I'm a huge proponent of adult education.
Yeah.
Because often, we adults are still the ones that are doing a lot of the decision making on the planet. We can focus a lot on raising these kids to be, climate justice warriors and social justice warriors and do all of this stuff. But, they're really not going to be able to do anything for a good another 10, 20, 30 years, some of them. So if we can also focus on adult education, that for me I think is something really important, and engage a little bit of lightness and fun in the process too.
Well, I love it. And we know there's research as well on how adults do need to be able to play, because that also helps with creativity, brain functioning, and other things that go along too. So I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to share, ladies, I'll share Sarah's website, her social media, everything will be on the show notes. But you have something, there's like a free resource out there. You called it a toolkit. Can you share just a little bit like what ladies could get if they go sign up for that?
Yeah, for sure. So it's Dr. Sarah Mackay/toolkit. So it's really a brain health toolkit that you can download, and I explore lots of different sort of fundamental ideas around taking care of yourself. For example, sleep. I think sleep is an underutilized superpower. It is one of my favourite things to do. And I also am a strategic afternoon napper. And I don't just say, go and get a good night's sleep. I say, this is how, this is why. Here's a really cool TED talk to listen to on sleep. If you're really like the academic research, here's a link to an academic paper. Here's a more lighthearted piece on how to manage insomnia. So I kind of approach the neurobiology with a little bit of theory, and then I give people some practical resources. So it's all pulled together in a brain health toolkit that people can go away and download.
I love it. I love it. Well, again, thank you so much for being on today and for writing this book and for doing, I know, ladies, if you go out to her website, she's got courses and other things available too. So I really would encourage you to go out and check out her website and everything that Sarah is putting out in the world. I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you're doing and how you're really helping change our generations behind us and all of that, so that they can have a happier and healthier life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, I invite you to go out to iTunes and please leave an honest rating and review. In the podcast world, this really helps other women find the podcast, and they can see if it resonates with others out there. So I really appreciate all your support and leaving me a rating.